Welcome to Understand Suicide, the podcast of journalist and therapist Paola Fontanelli. Since her father's suicide in 2005, Paola has dedicated her life to breaking the silence around this most stigmatized of subjects. Her book, Understanding Suicide, Living with Loss, Paths to Prevention, was nominated for the National Book Award in Brazil, and the English edition is now available on Amazon.
Today we're going to talk about suicide warning signs. This is a very important topic because it's one of the most effective ways to prevent suicide. If you know the warning signs and you know what to do, it can really be helpful. The other reason is because it's a very common source of guilt for survivors. I have heard so many times people say things like, well, I can't believe I didn't see it coming. Was it a warning sign? Was it trying to tell me something with that attitude or behavior? So this is what we're going to cover today. What we know from research is that most people do give warning signs before they take their own lives, but we are not trained to identify them. There are two types of warning signs, verbal and nonverbal. The verbal ones, they can be more generalized. So a person will come to you and say, I can't take this anymore, or I would be better off dead. Nothing makes sense to me anymore. It's just not worth it. What is the point of living? Or something like, I feel trapped. There's no meaning in life. I'm a burden. No one cares. No one cares about me. So some of these are very common. But at the time when you hear someone say things like that, it just doesn't cross your mind, does it? Or it can be more direct. They can actually say the word suicide or say things like, I want to kill myself or I want to die. So these are the verbal ones. Let's talk about the nonverbal ones. In general terms, they're very similar to symptoms of depression. So you see things like mood swings. A person becomes more agitated, they experience more anxiety, they become sad, and then they'll be happy again. Or they become aggressive, they withdraw from other people, they become more isolated. Substance use is pretty common too. They start using drugs, or they start drinking, or even increasing if they already drink, so they'll drink more alcohol more often. Sleep disturbances are quite common too, so they'll start sleeping a lot for long hours, or they will wake up during the night, or they just won't sleep at all. So that's something that you should watch out for. Someone will have no more joy, for example, in things and activities that they used to love doing. So they'll stop going to work, or they stop reading, or whatever gave them joy, they will stop doing that. Hopelessness is very, very common. So they'll say things like there's no point, there's no way out. They don't think that anyone can help them. They start to not care about their appearance. So they won't take showers, they won't wash their hair, or even the way they dress will be different. They can also start engaging in risky or self-destructive behavior, self-cutting or something like that. But even in activities, for example, they become interested in risky things, skydiving, or things that were just not very usual for them. They become interested in death-related issues, or even music. They start listening to music and reading poetry that talks about death, or books about death, or movies. And another one is they express fear of losing control or even hurting themselves. So in short, these are the most common warning signs that you should really pay attention to. But sometimes, even when there is a history of mental illness or prior suicide attempts, it's extremely hard to see these signs. Melinda, who is someone I interviewed in the past, is a good example of that. Her daughter had been struggling with depression and mental illnesses for years and years, and had even threatened to take her own life a few times. Every time it happened, Melinda would reach out to her daughter, she would talk to her, offer help, and in general just be present for her daughter. But even with all that, she told me that no one was able to see the signs when the day came. Not even her therapist and her sister, who had lunch with her on the day she died.
But in the past, that was her first attempt, and she completed it the very first time. But there were other times, like 5 to 7 other times in the last 17 years, maybe 5 to 10 times. I mean, where she would call me up and always say the same thing. I love you. I just can't take the pain anymore, and I've taken an overdose. But she hadn't taken an overdose, so she was reaching out for help. And every single time I called suicide prevention or the police or the fire department or anybody to get there as fast as they could, and each time she hadn't done anything and was madder and madder at me. Every time she got madder and madder at me, and I kept saying, Catherine, I'm trying to help you. But this time she didn't give me a chance. She didn't call anybody.
So today what you see is that there was a lot of pain, and she had a history of depression too.
17 years of depression. And she was on antidepressants for 17 years. And she wouldn't tell me who her psychiatrist was, but said she liked her. So when she died and I was cleaning out her apartment, I saw the pills with that doctor's name, and I called the doctor, and I've seen her twice and talked to her a couple of other times. And she just cried and cried and cried. She said, I didn't see it coming. I should have thought. She missed everything. Yeah. She said, I should have thought when she canceled that appointment that I should have called her or talked to her. So she's second guessing.
Yeah.
She said usually my daughter would call her to cancel or reschedule, but this time she texted her or emailed her. And she should have known that's out of character too. And she knew her dog was dying. But my daughter said to her, I'll be fine when my dog dies. So she didn't see the warning signs either. And she had lunch with her older sister the day she died. And she didn't see it, at lunch. She did not see. My daughter said, I'll see you the following weekend. I'm going to come over and visit my nieces.
So as you can see, it can really be extremely hard to see these signs. So overall, I've mentioned verbal and non-verbal warning signs, those that are quite similar, as I said before, to symptoms of depression. But there are other warning signs that are red flags because they signal that the person is quite advanced in his or her planning stages. Instead of ideation or thoughts, they have taken their planning more seriously. In these cases, immediate action is needed. What would they be? One of them is giving up prized possession or even pets. For those who have pets, you know that giving a pet away is heartbreaking and it doesn't even cross one's mind. So if they do give their pets away, pay close attention. It actually happened to Melinda's daughter. She didn't give it away, but before she died, she was talking to her mom, and she used to say that quite often, that the day her pet died would be the day she would die. And Melinda told me that her dog died a few days before she took her own life. So it just shows, how important and how much a person can love a dog or a pet. Another warning signs, one of these red flag ones, is a very abrupt positive mood change. So I've heard this before too, people saying, especially when the loved one used to have a mental illness, bipolar, or particularly depression. And they say, well, but they seem to be doing so much better. They were taking medication, and in the last days of their lives, they seem to be happier and doing well. But in truth, what happens is that this person has given up life, and they know in their minds and their hearts that they will not be around anymore. So the conflict, the pain is gone. I was reading a book by Tom Hunt. It's called Cliffs of Despair, A Journey to the Edge. And he actually exemplifies, he talks about this, and he says, well, if you know your pain is about to end, wouldn't it be normal to be calm? So that is a very good statement when it comes to this sudden change in mood, but positive change. So in truth, what happens is that they know they won't have the pain anymore. They know they won't be around. They will not be dealing with the pain anymore and the conflict. So there is a sense of calm. There is a sense of comfort and peace. They do seem to be doing better, but that's not the truth. Another one of these red flag warning signs is saying goodbye. This is so hard to identify. My dad, the day before he took his life, he went to my sister's to talk to her, and she actually noticed that there was something wrong, that there was this, feeling of saying goodbye. And she noticed something else too, that he started reminiscing and talking about the future. He just wouldn't talk about the future anymore. So just to give you an example, he was talking about me, and I was at the time abroad on vacation, and my sister would ask him, are you going to pick her up at the airport? And he would say, well, I remember this trip that we took in 19, blah, blah, blah. And he would talk about the past, because the reason why they don't talk about the future anymore is, again, because they have decided to die. So in their minds, there is no future anymore. This is a very common warning signs. If you talk about a party in the future, a trip, or even the next day, they avoid talking about the future. Not only that, but they go back to the past and they talk about past memories, like my dad did that day. The other one is getting affairs in order. This happens a lot when it comes to financial situation, because they don't want to leave debts behind. They don't want the family to have to deal with that. This is something that happened to my dad as well. A few months before he died, he called me and invited me to have lunch. During the lunch, he asked me if I could give him some documents, personal documents, because he wanted to open a joint account with me. And I said, sure, fine. At the time, he was having some financial difficulties, and I was trying to help him figure out how to pay debts and things like that. So he said, it would just be easier. So now, in hindsight, it's very easy for me to see that what he was doing was getting his financial situation in order, and not just that, but making it easy for me to do whatever needed to be done after his death. But of course, at the time, I didn't know anything about suicide. I didn't know anything about warning signs, and I just didn't think much of it. It just seemed like the right thing to do at the time. So now that you know what these warning signs are, the next step is, what should you do? Well, the first thing you need to do is to identify the stage of planning that the person is in. So to see within the continuum of suicide, which comes from suicidal thoughts and then it advances into ideation, the person can't stop thinking about it, and then they actually go into planning, attempt, and completion. So try to identify where they are. Are they just talking about suicide? Is this an idea that has been pretty constant? Are they talking about it all the time? Are they thinking about it all the time? Or are they planning? So because depending on where they are, you can actually make some decisions on courses of action, for example. Do they need to see a counselor or a therapist? Do they need to see a psychiatrist? Because it may be something related to a mental illness. Do you have to contact the family or not? Create a support system for this person or even hospitalize them. And this will depend on where they are in terms of planning. That's the first thing to do. The second thing to do is to speak directly about suicide. Don't beat around the bush. Don't be afraid to use the word suicide. This is a myth. A very common myth is for people to believe that if they say the word suicide, they're going to put the idea into someone's head. That is not true at all. It's actually the opposite. You relieve them of the burden of saying the word because you started the conversation. So don't be afraid to use the word suicide. If you can talk about it directly and use the word, you can ask questions. You can say things like, I'm so worried about you right now, and I was just wondering if you're thinking about harming yourself. So this is more subtle. You're not using the word, but it conveys the same message. So don't be afraid of asking straightforwardly the question about harming themselves, taking their own lives. Use whatever vocabulary is comfortable for you. Another idea is to say something like, well, I know things that have been hard for you lately, and I would like to help. Are you thinking about suicide? That's another suggestion. And a third one would be, well, I've noticed that you've been distant lately, you've been isolated, or mention whatever is happening in terms of changes in behavior. But say that you can always offer help. You can say something like, well, can I help you in any way? Or again, be direct, straightforward, and ask whether or not they're planning to harm themselves. Another good tip is to always bring hope into the conversation. Lack of hope is the hallmark of suicidal ideation. So the person who is thinking about taking their lives, they don't have hope anymore. So try to bring it into the conversation. Another action is to try to remove weapons and any harming object that they might use for the suicide. So decreasing the possibility of them having access to weapons or any of these kind of objects can really be helpful. Also be proactive. Instead of saying, if you know, for example, that they have depression and they haven't been leaving the home or they're not coming to school, they're just not around or isolated, instead of saying, call me if you need help, just show up. Knock on their door. And for example, if they need to go to a doctor and you think that that's the case, take them to a psychiatrist yourself. I did that to a friend of mine. She called me one day and I could identify that she was in a really bad place and she was actually thinking about suicide. She told me afterwards, and I told her, let's go to a doctor. So do that. Don't wait for them, because if it's depression, for example, the chances are that they will not have the energy to do anything. And the last thing we should talk about is what to avoid when you're having this kind of conversation with them, when you're talking about suicide, when you're asking them if they're thinking about taking their life. One of them is, do not interrupt the conversation. They should feel comfortable to really open up with you. And chances are not many people have tried to do that before. So they will have a lot on their minds and a lot to talk about. Just sit down, relax, do some breathing if you need, because this is going to be a very, very hard conversation to have. But do not interrupt. Let them talk first and truly, truly listen. Another thing that's very important is have no prejudice, no judgment. There's no right and wrong. Please do not tell them that they shouldn't do this because they're going to hurt X, Y, and Z, their kids, their dad, their mom, whatever, because this is not going to help. They know they're going to hurt them, but they're hurting so much and they want a way out of that pain. So that's not going to be helpful. Another thing to pay attention to is to not argue with them, because this is just going to compound their pain and their guilt and their shame, and it's not really going to do much in terms of helping. Avoid cliches, things like, oh, you have everything to live for. This is so useless in a moment of that much pain, and it's not going to help them in any way. Don't try to be invasive either. Respect their pace, or when they're talking, respect their pace, respect the limitations that they're going to have, the boundaries that they're going to set. It's not going to be easy for them to open up because they have been in pain for so long that they need time, and of course they need to trust that you will be a good listener. And one of the ways to do that is to not shame them. This is very important. Things like suicide is for cowards, for example, or suicide is the easy way out. If you say something like that, you just make them feel worse and worse, and you will help compound the pain. So confidentiality is another thing that's very important to think about, but it's a tricky one, because the first thing when we think about confidentiality, the first thing that comes to mind is, should we talk to the family, for example? That's a tough one, because sometimes the family is one of the sources of pain. So you have to really think about who you should contact when you're thinking in terms of building a support system, for example. So, of course, if they're children, that's different. But if they're adults, search for friends, contact people who are close and really care for them. It can even be a teacher, a mentor. Just be mindful about who you're going to include in this support system. Finally, do not blame yourself. You are trying to help, and in the end, you're not responsible for anybody's life. This is very important because it is quite common for people, especially survivors, to feel that they have not done enough. So keep that in mind and just be kind to yourself. Do whatever you can. Involve other people so you're not alone and you don't feel so responsible. And hopefully you will save a life. So I hope I have helped you today, and will be coming back because this is such an important topic when it comes to suicide, that we'll be talking about this many, many times in some other interviews in the future. And if you need more information, go to my website, understandsuicide.com. You have a lot of resources there. And thank you again for listening to my podcast.
You've been listening to Understand Suicide, the podcast of journalist and therapist Paola Fontanelli. If you've been touched by suicide and believe your story might help others, please consider contacting Paola through her website, understandsuicide.com.